that previous video is a very hard one to deliver because I'm not interested in offending anyone, and I'm not interested in specifically promoting a particular point of view in history other than what seems to make sense to me. And but it's hard to avoid it when you look at topics such as the historical Jesus. But we get on a little bit more comfortable ground when we move away from the founder of Christianity and look at still some people who are revered by Christians world around, to understand how the church and synagogue could grow so far apart. So let's begin that discussion now. Undoubtedly, to understand the direction that Christianity took after Jesus' death is we have to look at the work of Saul of Tarsus, also known as Saint Paul. Now, Paul never actually met Jesus in conventional real life. He encountered the risen Jesus, as he describes, on the road to Damascus. Here's an amazing depiction of this from the 16th century. Here, check this out. This is the risen Jesus here, a very dramatic kind of posture with the angelic host and so on. And in the story that Paul describes, once he sees the risen Jesus, he's struck blind for several days and like incapacitated, and it's like an overwhelming experience for him. He eventually comes to his senses and he realizes that he's got to go on a mission to talk about Jesus and his teachings, and he is wildly successful. Before we leave this painting, just look at how the horse is at the center of the composition. It's such a powerful emotion on the horse's face. I mean, that's really something that I admire. I'm not an art historian, but I love these kinds of things. At any rate, back to Paul. He goes on this massive journey, devoting his life to touring the Eastern Mediterranean. He goes through Asia Minor and the Greek peninsula and the Italian peninsula, and his word reaches, perhaps through extensions, even to the Iberian Peninsula. And everywhere he goes, he's speaking primarily to Jewish audiences in the diaspora and to fellow travelers with those small diaspora communities whenever possible, and reaching out beyond the Jewish community to talk about what Jesus said and what it means for society. Now, it is at this point that we should understand that Christianity had a tremendous amount to offer the peoples of the world. It took some of the key ideas of Judaism, such as life after death, that's a big plus, a personal deity that actually listens to prayer, that is full of mercy, that has requirements of humanity, that holds humanity to task, that there is a mission for humanity, all kinds of really amazing things. And of course, attaching it to a religion of great antiquity. And at the same time, Christianity omitted a lot of the sort of high barriers to admission to Judaism. Judaism at this point is still very much an ethnicity, a people. One may convert to Judaism, famous conversion story in the Bible, for example, the story of Ruth, but it's still primarily an ethnos, and one gets into it by being descended from other Jews. And in order to make that leap into the Jewish community, one would have to submit, if one were a male, to circumcision. And then, of course, there's all the ritual commandments, like as maintaining the dietary laws, observing the Sabbath, and so on. And these things are quite onerous, especially if you don't appreciate how amazingly beneficial they are. So there are a lot of Gentiles who are attracted to these ideas, maybe attracted to Judaism itself, but not necessarily willing to undertake those kind of responsibilities. And Paul finds he has a huge audience. He has people who are really listening to him. At the same time, one of the most obvious questions he's going to be asked is like, so what's different between you and other Jews? And he's got to explain the relationship between this new emerging ideology and the mother ideology of Judaism. This is where you begin to see something that's called the Adversus Judaeos literary tradition. It's exemplified in particular by John Chrysostom, but we see many other figures among the church fathers who are participating in it, which is kind of like against the Jews. There's a discussion of why Christianity is better that involves why Judaism is worse, why Judaism is a less so kind of ideology. And this obviously has, negative connotations and will have negative repercussions, particularly as the debate becomes much more Gentile versus Jew, us versus them, and this will proceed apace over the next few centuries. Where we see this especially clearly is in the Ecclesia et Synagoga theme, the church and synagogue theme, which, to jump ahead for a few centuries to illustrate this point, you see it in Gothic art in particular. Here's some monumental architecture from Strasbourg that shows on the left the ecclesia, which represents the church, and you can see she's got an upright staff signifying her authority. Her bodice is done up properly. She's wearing a crown. She's regal. She's clear-eyed, and so on. And on the right is the fallen synagogue, which you can see that she's holding the Ten Commandments in her left hand, her weaker hand, and upside down. They're falling out of her hands. She's not even attached to the law properly. The staff or spear that represents her authority is broken. She's blindfolded, and she's even in an act of decline. She's like falling away from the rock. And this kind of image of contrasting the church to the synagogue, in which the synagogue is the lesser partner, is something that we see over and over again as the church fathers develop this adversus Judaeos kind of literary tradition. Here's another example. There are literally hundreds and hundreds of them. This is from the Church of Notre Dame, and you can see that synagogue has all the same kind of elements, but her eyes are blinded by a serpent, right? Clearly an allusion to the serpent of Genesis and so on, that is not permitting her to see the truth of Christianity. And here's one especially notorious one from the 14th century, a stained glass window in Verben, Germany, that on the left you can see the church being crowned by heaven, holding the upright staff, the chalice, and so on, riding a tetramorph, a being of mystical significance. And on the right, the synagogue, broken staff, crown knocked off the head, blindfolded. And just to make sure you got the point, a sword is driving through the top of her skull, indicating divine displeasure. And one other detail, by the way, before we leave this, I find it fascinating that Jesus in this particular image is clearly represented with dark skin, which seems to be something that really energizes a certain portion of my audience. Here you go, fascinating representation. So back to our topic, however, there's clearly a period of time that begins with Paul and extends on later, where the synagogue is derided, the synagogue is put down, that the church is clearly ascendant. Some would say that Paul advanced a kind of replacement theory. There are passages in his writings that suggest that might not be totally accurate, but at any rate, this is the general trend that will be evinced over the next few hundred years. Now, the Jewish community is not standing still while all this happens. There is a reaction from the Jewish world as well. One might even suggest we don't know which is the action and which is the reaction. Perhaps they happen around the same time. But this particular text, the so-called blessing of the heretics, appears probably around the end of the 1st century. Its creation is described in the Talmud, in Tractate Brachot, page 28, in which a person named Shmuel HaKatan, Samuel the Lesser, is given the task of creating a passage in the liturgy, the mandatory central part of the liturgy called the Amidah, or the 18 blessings, that is designed somehow to make a clear distinction between Jewish Jews and Jewish Christians. In other words, you have this kind of amorphous period of time in the decades following Jesus' death, in which it's not clear what a Jew should believe and what a Christian may practice. And so they ask Samuel to create this blessing, which is inserted into the mandatory prayers, and it's not actually a blessing, it's really a curse. Now, there's a significant amount of debate about exactly how this was created, how it was placed into liturgy, how it was enforced. But if we look at the text itself, it says in English, "Let there be no hope for informers." Now, that informer is a euphemistic term here for a Jewish Christian, for reasons which goes beyond the scope of our talk. "And may all wickedness instantly perish. May all the enemies of your people be swiftly cut off," etc., etc. And the idea is that, as much of the historiography argues, that if a person was suspected of being a Jewish Christian, meaning a Jew with Christian beliefs, they would be asked to recite the prayers publicly, as part of the prayer service. And when they came to this new passage, it was kind of like a litmus test. If they read it, then they would be pronouncing a curse on themselves if they harbored Christian beliefs. On the other hand, if they omitted it, they would be outing themselves as a Christian and theoretically could be removed not only from the pulpit but from the synagogue. There's some analysis that suggests that the gospel according to John was written by someone who experienced this. And in fact, his gospel is much more filled with invective than the synoptic gospels, references to the synagogue of Satan and things like that. So this was kind of like a line in the sand that from the Jewish perspective marked off an ideological boundary that was not present before the inclusion of this text in the prayer. So we see that this is a family dispute that has gone really sour, and they're separating from both sides. Finally, let us not forget the fact that by the time we get to the early 4th century, Christianity has become so large and so popular that ultimately becomes the state religion under Constantine, shown here. The famous story behind it, there's some interesting things about his family that were attracted to Christianity as well, but he would have this dream where he would see, or this vision where he would see this cross, and it would say, in hoc signo vinces, under this sign will you conquer. And then when he pieced it together that it was attached to Christianity, that's when he converted. That's the traditional story associated with it. But with his conversion and his, stamp of approval on Christianity, a once heavily persecuted faith, not only reading the Gospels by people like Paul as a Pharisee, who was bent on persecuting the church, but also clearly by the Romans, who sent Christians to the gladiatorial games and things like that. This represents a dramatic turning point where the once despised religion is now a state religion with far more power, and that's actually going to be the status quo in Europe until the modern era. Okay, I hope you found this useful. We're going to continue in the next videos by going back to Judea and focusing on internal Jewish politics, and we're going to look specifically at the origins of the Great Revolt. Thank you very much for watching.